Good to be here. Today I'm going to talk about something a little different from what I've been talking about the last few times I've been here. I've been mainly focusing on architecture and technology, and I thought I'd take a crack at looking at some other more relevant issues, the issues of business models. So, I won't spend time on this. We're all familiar with what's happening in terms of the environment around us, the demands which are being placed on our networks, the expectations of customers. But along with this is what is happening is the whole notion of service and services and the value chain in services is changing. And so that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. But to get there, I'll need to step back a bit to the network and then get to the business of business cases and business models. So to address these disruptions and demands which are being placed on the network, what have we been doing over these last few years? We've been trying to head towards a transformation of the network, which to me looks like this. So think of this as one view of the target, which is a cloud, but it's not the typical cloud which we talk about when we talk about the large cloud providers. It's a distributed cloud. It's a cloud of clouds, however you want to talk about it. But there are edge clouds, there are core clouds, and you can have more. And they're all stitched together with a programmable network. And you can place network functions at different places in the network based on the need, the demand. And we've been rethinking how we need to build these networks, the notion of what is a network capability and what is a service are starting to blur. And clearly, we want to try and push services closer to the points of consumption. So this is what we're trying to do. And all the technologies we've been talking about here, in this conference and others, SDN, NFV, all of these things we've developed over the last few years to try and get here to try and address those challenges. But where are we now? So over the past few years, these notions of SDN and NFV have matured a bit. We've created this notion of telco clouds. We've talked about cloudification of the network. We've talked about having a more data center-like infrastructure in the carrier networks. So that's where we were till about a year and a half ago, when there was a movement to the left. We call it a left shift, which is away from this notion of a core cloud, a telco cloud, to the edge. And it's really a major step towards that vision I was showing you a little earlier. And the characteristics of this are, though you have a core and you have clouds at the core of the network, there's this notion of a network edge, which is closer to the endpoints, and you need to address how you're going to handle the edge. And the real impetus for this is that being at the edge, being closer to the customer, you're able to provide at least a perception of unlimited bandwidth, provide services which are tailor-made, context-aware. So that's why there's this gold rush sort of to the edge. Everyone is trying to do things at the edge and create capabilities there. But I'd like you to stop a bit and think about, what is this edge? Where is this edge, and where does it need to be? So, as an industry, we've developed this notion of mobile edge computing for the telco industry, which is talking about putting computing at the network edge and doing all sorts of good things. And the expectations are, okay, once we do this, we have the ability to do low latency stuff. High bandwidth, as I mentioned. We're able to tailor computation to the needs. And perhaps can start to think of new consumption models as a service consumption models. And with this, we're hoping that we can do give better experience to the users. We can create new service categories, obviously cost efficiencies. But I think one of the things which perhaps gets overlooked a bit is the notion of new business models which are emerging and which have to be addressed to really do this. So all of these services we know about, we can talk about how we can deliver these services, but how do we actually monetize all this? So let's look at what we're calling the edge computing battleground. So the network edge is only one part. The traditional notion of network edge, the MEC concept, is one part of where the edge truly is. And so we have capabilities you can place all the way from the device right into deep inside the network. And I think we need to take an expanded view of the edge and look at this space all the way from the customer edge into the core, into the aggregation points. And you can think about placing these computing capabilities anywhere in this spectrum of locations. But the interesting thing is that once you start to do this, you realize that there are other players who are trying to do the same thing in these spaces. And so I think the way forward here for telecom providers, for communication service providers, is really to address this head on and understand that they need to play with these other players in this space. They need to both compete and cooperate with various parties along the edge. And you can do that only if you look at a set of new service models and business models. So we took a look at this, focusing on this notion of edge, on this notion of this sort of edge spread out over these locations I talked about. And obviously you can package these and categorize these in many ways. We found it useful to look at these in 5 categories. So many use cases, but these categories all the way from just providing hardware and hosting to providing layers of as a service, to doing things like custom system integration kind of services, business to business services with end customer in mind, and then directly end customer services. Right. So we took a look at these and tried to look at some canonical use cases for each of these and build some economics around that and look at things like net present value, rate of return, and see where do we get when we look at these various models. So I'll just quickly go through a snapshot of a visual for each one of these models to help you see what we've been doing. So dedicated edge hosting, clearly you're providing the infrastructure, just the hardware or hardware plus a little software to help it. But you can provide it to an infrastructure as a service provider, who then provides it to enterprises and others. You can provide this to someone like a CDN provider. You can provide this to a whole different kind of industry, for example, car manufacturers, where their edges are in the vehicles. And when you look at these things, and you look at the business case for that, and we've obviously abstracted away the numbers and tried to provide a representative view. Those bars you see there, the reds are obviously expense, and the green is where it's becoming cash flow positive. This is not a time picture, right? So we looked at a 3-year window, but these are various categories of activity. So installation costs, equipment costs, those are primarily the ones on the left, which are red. And then you get to services and revenue and licenses revenue, et cetera. And that's where you become green. So over a 3-year period, this kind of model yielded a 26% internal rate of return. Seems very good. Good rate of return. We should go ahead and do this. But when you look at this as an actual value at the end of these 3 years and the projection beyond, value is very low. So my point in spending a little time on this is to say, when we look at these business models, you can't just look at one sort of metric or one number and base your investment decisions or your change decisions on that. You have to look at a combination and see what you really want to do here. So the same thing happens with when you look at edge layers of service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, et cetera. And so you can think of providing cloud portals, which are essentially providing infrastructure as a service to SaaS providers, right? For example, those which are doing analytics on large data. Or you can provide this to developers and startups as a platform as a service. And here you can think of things like virtual reality and gaming. Or you can provide this directly to business customers as, a network capability as a service. And this is where perhaps you can think of the automotive industry. And again, when we looked at this, so just to remind you that these are all categories of use cases. There are many use cases in each of these business models, but each of these business models requires a different kind of engagement with the customer and a different kind of approach of how you deliver services. Here again, the rate of return is a little less than before, not that great, but when you look at this over the long term in terms of actual value and going forward, potential value, this is high. Okay. Clearly, another thing to look at is system integration, where you're doing specific projects for specific, for example, enterprise customers. Here, when you look at the rate of return, it's, again, similar, but the terminal view is very low. And I'll talk a bit more about the other two business models, but just wanted to pause for a second and remind you that earlier in this session, it's good, you heard the context of the need to look at business models, et cetera, but that was talking about business models between a telco and a vendor. Clearly, there needs to be change in those business models. Here, I'm talking about between the telco and its customers. And my point here is that this change we're talking about spreads through the value chain. You cannot just change it here. I can't just change how I'm doing my network without changing how I consume hardware and software from vendors. So that relationship definitely has to change. But if I don't change how I deliver services and what I deliver to my customers and what kind of business arrangements I get there, I think, again, we're missing the point that we're trying to do the old world in a new way by just changing our network, changing all the relations with vendors, but I sell the same services to my customers in the same way. I don't think that's going to work. So that's why I think it's important to pay attention to these, and from a telco perspective, to look at what you want to be and what you want to do before you embark, or as you embark on this transformation journey. So the other, perhaps more lucrative approach is to actually provide businesses higher layer capabilities, where you're providing entire solution capabilities to vendors. You can think of actual systems which provide video and the ability to do commercial transactions in locations. You can think of monitoring and surveillance. You can think of providing total experience environments to business customers. And when you do this, where you're not only just providing, you're taking the infrastructure and platform, and network as a service, and adding on applications on top to do this. Here now, you get a healthy rate of return, but also the terminal value and the prospective value is good. It's something which makes sense to look in the long term. And then you get to the last kind of business model we looked at, which is now you're providing an entire experience, the whole service directly to the end users, whether it's a virtual reality or gaming kind of thing. And here, again, the terminal value in terms of absolute value is high, and it's in the near term, it's a medium rate of return. And again, just a reminder that those bars are not time, they are different categories of expenditures and revenue. So when we look at all these business models, how should a communication service provider proceed? Should they try to do any one of these, multiple of these? And what does it mean to embark on one of these journeys using this kind of a business model? And I think what you really have to do is look at the capabilities of your network, how you're transforming it, but also the capabilities from a operations and business perspective of how you think you're changing. So what we did here is put those business model categories on top, and all the way at the end, on the left, is a set of characteristics we think which a carrier has or needs to have to offer the kind of services which are under the dedicated hosting kind of business model. And on the right, we put the other extreme of what's required at for the end-to-end consumer application kind of view. And obviously, across the spectrum from left to right is a set of characteristics you need to address all of these business models. And I think this is what is required when you look at how you need to transform your network. Take a look at what you want to do, what you want to be, what kind of business model suits your infrastructure or the path you're on. And that's what I think is the most important challenge we face right now, because we can put all these things in the network, we can try to transform, but we don't have this view of the business model in mind. I think it's going to lead to a lot of issues in the future. So with that, I think I'll end early. I give 2 minutes back to your session. Thank you all.